Friends, the book I want to discuss briefly now is called The Muslim Vanishes by Saeed Naqvi, a play. So this book was published last year. Some of you may be familiar with Saeed Naqvi. He's an Indian journalist. He is what in India is called a senior journalist. He's a veteran in the journalism field. And I can certainly recall some pieces from him, or perhaps more accurately, I can recall his name from at least 4 decades ago. The most arresting thing about this play, which has received great accolades when it was published last year. So there are blurbs from Arun Shourie, from Hansal Mehta, Mark Tully. Mark Tully, some of you might know, is a long-standing BBC journalist who's lived in India for decades. He's practically Indian, many people would say. And he's considered to be a friend of India. So there are accolades from Mark Tully, Hansal Mehta, Arun Shourie, from the great filmmaker Adur Gopalakrishnan, from Meghnad Desai, who was a member of the House of Lords in Britain, and indeed even from Ashish Nandi, an Indian intellectual of enormous distinction. Now, my own feelings about this book are mixed, but not because I disagree with the author. Rather, it has to do with what I would describe as some problems in thinking about art, because this is a play, and we have to think about the relationship between art and didacticism. And this is undoubtedly a didactic work. It has characters who are drawn from history, not entirely. The first half we hear more through the mouths of two characters called Anand and Brajesh, who are TV anchors. And in the subsequent portion of the book, mainly really in the second half, we encounter three great characters. Alauddin Khan, the great Indian musician, who, of course, was the guru to a whole host of people, Ravi Shankar, Nikhil Banerjee, Annapurna Devi, who didn't really perform in public. This is the wife of Ravi Shankar, and a great many others. And in addition to Alauddin Khan, we have the great figure from the period of the Delhi Sultanate, Amir Khusro, right? A gigantic figure, to use the English expression, a Renaissance figure. And then from more recent times, we have another Muslim, and his name is Hasrat Mohani. And before I get into the book, I should say that one of the things that the book does, to its great credit, is by taking these people as the principal characters, it alerts us in a way that some readers may not be familiar with to the singular importance of all of these three figures in the history of India, in the history of the Muslim community, if you want to put it this way, although I think that these are really Indian figures. They happen to be Muslims, of course. Some of them did advocate for the rights of Muslims. But I think it would be a mistake to see them really as Muslim figures, and I think that this play is partially about that, right? So just to give an indication, when I speak about their importance, think about the figure of Hasrat Mohani, who appears in this play, and in fact, there are a great many sentiments and opinions that he voices, and he's describing really the position that he had. So he appears as a character, but this is a person who was, in fact, a person of considerable importance in the 20th century. Hasrat Mohani was a member of the Indian National Congress for a very long period of time. He was also a member of the All India Muslim League, or the Muslim League as it's known. in short. In fact, he even served as its president. But when the partition plan was announced on 3rd March 1947, on 3rd June of 1947, Hazrat Mohani resigned from the Muslim League because he was always one of these Indian Muslims like Maulana Azad who stood for the idea of a syncretic and secular India. And India was his home. And he claimed rightly that he had as much right to claim India as his home as anyone else. Right? So he stayed behind in India after the partition. But he was also, by the way, one of the founders of the Communist Party of India in 1925. And if all of this was not sufficient, I can tell you that he was also one of those people who was critically important in pushing forward the resolution for Purna Swaraj, complete independence. A resolution that was passed by the Indian National Congress at its Lahore session in December 1929. Right? This is a moment that we often associate only with Jawaharlal Nehru, but Hazrat Mohani was critically important in passing that resolution. Right? But let me get now to really the subject of the book. And the title says everything, right? The Muslim vanishes. Imagine if the Muslim just vanished from India. If 200 million Muslims vanished. This, you might say, of course, is the dream of some of the people in Hindu nationalism. And what this play does rather wickedly and arrestingly and humorously is to suggest through the conversation that takes place between various characters, what might be some of the problems that the Hindus might encounter, that some of the Hindus who cherish this dream that India should be Muslim free, right? Muslim-mukt, free. What would happen if India became singularly free of Muslims? If 200 million Muslims vanished. There's a scene here, by the way, where a person looks out of the window and says, it seems that the Qutb Minar has vanished. It's no longer there, right? Because, of course, it's the institutions of Muslim rule are there in India as well. The architecture, right? And, of course, the fact that the Qutb Minar vanishes is doubtless an allegory, something that calls to mind, of course, what happened to the Babri Masjid, which did vanish. It was made to vanish when it was destroyed by a crowd of Hindu ideologues, egged on by, I should say a crowd of Hindus, egged on by Hindu ideologues, by BJP leaders, among others, on 6th December 1992. Right? Okay. So I should also say that in his preface, Saeed Naqvi says that that one of the things that really struck him, and in a way really almost got him thinking about this subject, was that when Nelson Mandela became the first leader of Free South Africa, he appointed 9 Indians to his cabinet. 9 Indians. There might have been, by the way, more than 9 Indians. There might have been a few more, but there were 9 Muslims, and they outweighed the Hindus. Right? And he says that a friend of his in South Africa said that this preeminence of Muslims in the cabinet disturbed him because it was Gandhiji who had fought for the rights of Indians. And this friend of his obviously thought that since Gandhi himself was a Hindu, it should have been Hindus who should have been appointed to the cabinet of Nelson Mandela. But Nelson Mandela was no fool. He knew the role played by South African Indian Muslims as well, right? And I had the great privilege of meeting one of these Indians, Fatima Mir, on my first visit to South Africa 16, 17 years ago. But she was not the only person. I mean, there were so many of them. Ahmed Kathrada, right? A very close associate of Nelson Mandela, played such an enormous role in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Yusuf Dadoo, who was one of the principal figures in the South African Communist Party and in the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, the record of Indian Muslims is extraordinary in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela did the right thing in appointing so many Indians, and particularly Indian Muslims, because to his first cabinet, because this was meant to be an inclusive government, right? But anyhow, he says that, Saeed Naqvi says he's reflecting back that he was almost shocked when he heard this comment from his friend expressing disappointment that so many Muslims, South African Indian Muslims, had been appointed to this cabinet. And so what this book about is really about the subject of communalism. It's about caste. And he says, and this is where it gets a little pedestrian, where it gets a little predictable, that caste differentiation and communal differentiation and hierarchies, all of this is, he says, it seems in the DNA of the Indian. I'm not so certain that it's in the DNA of the Indian. In fact, one could argue really to the contrary as well, that this has been a very ecumenical civilization. But I think that we should understand the spirit in which he is writing all of this, right? Because Saeed Naqvi himself is one of those Indian Muslims who is a representative of that great Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis for which India is really distinct. India is one of the few places in the world, right? And unquestionably the most important, which showed how another civilization existed alongside Islamic civilization, right? Okay, and of course in North India particularly, we speak often of the Ganga-Yamuna tahzeeb, the culture, okay, that developed between these two rivers in the Gangetic Plains in the Doab, right, between the two rivers, a culture of extraordinary syncretism and represented by figures such as Alauddin Khan, right, and Amir Khusro and Hasrat Muani. So now we begin to see why these three Muslims are important in his narrative. But what is really interesting here is those passages where these characters begin to talk about what some of the problems are that have developed because now that the Muslims have vanished, right? So in the play, what happens, and this is breaking news, the real breaking news is that somehow suddenly 200 million Muslims have vanished. They have left behind their homes, their farms, their cowsheds, their land, their businesses. And all of this can now be taken over by Indians. So perhaps India will now really can be taken over by Hindus. And so perhaps India can now really become a genuine socialist country because it can now distribute all of this among the poor, right? And perhaps identity politics will no longer be important. But then these characters keep on discussing the developments as they unfold, and this is where the play becomes wickedly interesting, becomes really humorous almost, right? Because, for example, what happens now is, now that the Muslims have disappeared, the differences between the Savarnas and the Avarnas, the high castes and the low caste, suddenly become really dominant. They become preeminent, these differences. And in one panchayat election, they discover, and this becomes them the norm, they discover that the Avarnas, who numerically, of course, completely outweigh the Savarnas, right? We must understand that the upper castes in India, and particularly the Brahmins, are a minuscule minority. Right? I mean, 85% of the country is really lower caste in some sense of the term, right? If you include all the SCs and all the OBCs, etc., right? We're talking about really a very small percentage of the population that can be considered really upper caste, and particularly Brahmin, as I said. And so in this one panchayat election, in this imaginary world now that we're speaking about, now that all the Muslims have vanished, they have left, right? in this one panchayat election, it is only the Avarnas who get elected. And this puts the Savarnas, the upper caste, into a real panic, right? Pakistan, incidentally, is almost delirious with joy because it's saying, now that the Muslims have left India, India is showing its true colors. Now we can actually comfortably deal with India because now it is a Hindu preponderant state. There are really no Muslims there anymore. So now it shows that at last India has come around to the point of view that yes, Pakistan is a counterpart to India and India is a counterpart to Pakistan. One is a Muslim state, the other is a Hindu state. India is no longer pretending to be a sovereign secular republic, right? So Pakistan is delirious with joy when it sees that these 200 million Muslims have vanished from India. Right? Now, I think it is this kind of discussion that makes this play, as I said, really interesting. But I want to go back to my earlier criticism, and one of those criticisms is that it is very didactic in many ways. These characters are really preaching. They're preaching unity. And of course, there are many incidents that are referred to which are incidents from real life. So for those of you who are not familiar with the story of Muhammad Akhlaq, this is a Muslim about whom it was alleged that he kept beef in his refrigerator, right? And he's killed. And the mob comes into his home and they open the refrigerator, and then this meat is taken for a lab analysis, and he points out that an autopsy of Muhammad Akhlaq is considered to be of no consequence, but a lab analysis of this meat is considered to be of critical importance. Then there's a story of Pelu Khan, right? This is a person who was stopped in the middle. He had actually purchased some cows, and he's stopped by a gang of people who accuse him of stealing these cows and taking them to be massacred, and Pelu Khan is killed. And there's the notorious incident at Una, where Dalit boys who were skinning the carcass of a dead cow are going to be actually skinned, right? I mean, themselves, they're going to be whipped, and this is all captured on video, right? So there are all these horrific incidents, and you learn about them. But as I said, the many of the characters are really narrating things from history books, including Alauddin Khan, who quite rightly points out that really there are elements of the culture of India over which no community really has a monopoly, right? That's what Alauddin Khan says. Let me try to see if I can locate the exact passages. So this is on page 122. In music, poetry, painting, architecture, matters of language and cuisine, it is criminal for any one community to claim exclusive authorship. And of course, I mean, Alauddin Khan, who himself was a devout Muslim, but also worshipped Saraswati, right? I remember Ustad Bismillah Khan, who stayed in Varanasi or Banaras nearly all of his life. And he would go to the temple as well, right? He would pay obeisance. He would play at the temple. Right? At the Kashi Vishwanath Mandir. And there's so many instances of musicians. And so, of course, one has to agree with Alauddin Khan. The same thing can be said of cuisine, of architecture, right? To claim exclusive authorship in all of these matters, whether it's language, Hindustani, right? Whether it's cuisine, whether it's architecture, whether it's music, it is criminal for any one community to claim exclusive authorship. But these are points that are made, in a didactic fashion. And there's this very serious question of whether didacticism really works in art. But notwithstanding these limitations, I think this play is worth a read. And as I said, Saeed Naqvi has said everything with the great title of this book, The Muslim Vanishes. Thank you.